In the heart of Elara, a town where traditions hold sway and every family is a community's pride, lived Adrian Kem, a man who was the envy of all. To many, Adrian represented the pinnacle of success. At just 39, he was one of the wealthiest men in the region. His businesses spanned farming estates, transportation networks, and even international trade. His name opened doors, his wealth closed conversations. Yet, for all his achievements, one question followed him wherever he went: why is Adrian Kem not married? Adrian was a man of ambition, a man who believed that love, marriage, and family were distractions. His heart and soul were poured into his empire, a legacy he was determined to build with precision and care. To Adrian, marriage was a complication he neither wanted nor needed, at least not yet. But to the people of Elara, especially his family, his decision was a puzzle that begged to be solved. Margaret Nkem, a widow, had spent her life raising her only child. She had watched with pride as Adrian transformed their family's fortunes, pulling them out of poverty and into prominence. But her joy was overshadowed by a deep concern: her son's refusal to marry. In Elara, a man's success was incomplete without a wife and children to carry on his name. For Margaret, the thought of Adrian growing older alone was unbearable. In a town like Elara, where community meant everything, Margaret's situation was a quiet embarrassment. Her friends celebrated weddings and christenings, their homes filled with the laughter of children, while Margaret's house remained silent. It wasn't that Adrian couldn't marry; he had wealth, charm, and countless suitors. But despite her prayers, her prodding, and her pleas, Adrian simply wasn't interested. Margaret was a woman of deep faith, and in her frustration, she turned to God. She begged for guidance, for divine intervention to soften Adrian's heart and open his eyes to the importance of family. But even as she prayed, she couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps her son's ambitions had grown too large, his world too distant from hers. To Adrian, the weight of expectations meant little. He saw his mother's worries as misplaced, her fears as unfounded. To him, life was a series of carefully calculated steps, and marriage was a chapter he would write only when he chose, if at all. What Margaret saw as a necessity, Adrian dismissed as a distraction. Two lives bound by love, but divided by priorities. Margaret, with her faith and her traditions, could not understand why her son defied the path laid out for him. Adrian, with his ambition and determination, could not see why his mother clung so tightly to a dream he did not share. Yet, beneath the surface of their lives, cracks were beginning to form, cracks that neither prayer nor success could easily mend. Adrian had everything a man could want, except the one thing his mother believed mattered most. In a town where every life was a story and every family a legacy, Adrian's refusal to marry was not just his choice, it was a defiance that would set the stage for something neither he nor Margaret could foresee. Margaret Nkem was not a woman to accept defeat easily. Determined to see her son married, she took matters into her own hands. Over the weeks that followed, her home became a meeting ground, where she introduced Adrian to young women she deemed perfect, intelligent, respectful, and beautiful. To Margaret, these introductions were acts of love, a mother's attempt to guide her son toward what she believed was his destiny. Each of these women came from respectable families, their qualities carefully chosen to complement Adrian's success. But Adrian's heart was unmoved. For every introduction Margaret arranged, Adrian had an excuse. "She's too short," he would say. "Too loud. Too timid. Too ambitious." To Margaret, his dismissals were baffling. To Adrian, they were justified. He had no intention of committing, and these gatherings, though polite, were nothing more than an obligation. Margaret tried to remain patient, but her resolve was tested with every rejection. For each young woman she introduced, she carried the hope that Adrian would finally open his heart. Yet, time and again, those hopes were dashed. Frustrated and desperate, Margaret turned to the one place that had never failed her faith. She knelt before God, pouring out her heart, praying for divine intervention to change her son's mind. She believed that with enough prayers, with enough faith, Adrian would finally see the need to embrace the path she had laid out for him. Margaret sowed seeds in her church, giving offerings and fasting for days at a time. To her, this was not just about marriage, it was about securing her family's future, ensuring that the Nkem name would endure for generations. But while Margaret prayed, planned, and hoped, Adrian remained steadfast in his refusal. To him, these introductions were distractions, interruptions in a life dedicated to ambition. For Margaret, they were acts of faith and love. Yet the growing divide between them was a silence that neither prayer nor persuasion could yet bridge. Adrian, a man of few distractions. To those around him, his avoidance of close relationships with women was seen as dedication to his work. It was easy to assume that his ambition left no room for matters of the heart. But for those who looked closer, there were moments, quiet, fleeting, that told a different story. At every event, every gathering, Adrian's disinterest in female companionship was unmistakable. Yet, his bond with Eric, his best friend and business partner, was undeniable. Where others saw friendship, there were moments that suggested something deeper, a closeness that often went unspoken but never unnoticed. Eric had been a constant presence in Adrian's life. From business meetings to casual outings, they were inseparable. Their connection was one of trust and familiarity, a bond that seemed unshakable. But for Margaret, Adrian's mother, there were times when that bond raised questions she dared not ask. Margaret noticed these moments, but her love for her son and her faith in his character made it easier to dismiss them. To her, Eric was simply a loyal friend, someone who shared Adrian's drive and supported his ambitions. Anything more was a thought she refused to entertain. But deep down, doubt had begun to creep in. It was not suspicion, but something more fragile, an unease she couldn't name. Margaret told herself it was nothing, that her son's world of wealth and success was simply different from her own. Yet, the quiet gestures, the subtle glances, lingered in her mind like unanswered questions. For Adrian, his bond with Eric was a refuge, a space free from the expectations that surrounded him. For Margaret, it was a reminder of how little she truly understood the man her son had become. And while she prayed for answers, the truth remained hidden, seen by some, dismissed by others, but known only to Adrian himself. Margaret Nkem was a woman driven by love, but as the years passed and her son remained unmoved, her love turned into desperation. She had prayed, pleaded, and introduced him to countless women, yet Adrian's heart remained closed. For Margaret, the thought of leaving this world without seeing her son settle down and carry on their family's legacy was unbearable. And so, she made a decision that would shake the very foundation of her relationship with Adrian. Margaret concocted a story, one so grave that it would leave Adrian no choice but to act. She claimed to be gravely ill, her time on earth limited. It was a lie she justified in her heart, a lie born out of fear and love. The news hit Adrian like a thunderbolt. His mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, was now gravely ill. The doctor's voice was measured but clear. Margaret had cancer and had little time left. Adrian's ward, carefully built and meticulously planned, suddenly felt fragile. For Margaret, the role was not an easy one to play. As she lay in the hospital bed, her heart ached for her son's worry, but she steeled herself, knowing that this was the only way to push him toward the life she had always dreamed for him. Adrian, shaken to his core, made a vow. He promised his mother that he would find a wife within 3 months, that he would start a family and give her a grandchild to hold before it was too late. It was a promise made out of love, guilt, and fear, one he could not take back. Margaret's plan had worked, but at what cost? As she lay there in the quiet of the hospital room, the gravity of her actions began to sink in. She had forced her son's hand, but in doing so, had woven a web of deception that she could no longer untangle. For now, though, she chose to focus on the promise he had made, the hope it carried, and the love that had driven her to such lengths. Margaret has gambled with the truth to secure her son's future. But as the days ahead would reveal, even the best laid plans can unravel in ways no one could foresee. Adrian, a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and navigating the corridors of power, found himself in an unfamiliar setting. On his mother's urging and his own recent promise, he decided to attend church, not to worship, but to search. Among the devout women of Ilara, he hoped to find someone who could fulfill his mother's wish and his newfound obligation. A wife. Among the crowd, Adrian's gaze settled on a young woman named Naomi. Her presence was understated but commanding, her movements precise, her demeanor respectful. She led the ushering team with grace, her voice calm yet firm as she directed worshippers. To Adrian, she stood apart from the rest, poised, devout, and reserved. Naomi was the embodiment of everything Adrian believed he needed, a God-fearing woman who carried herself with dignity and restraint. She spoke little, but her actions spoke volumes. To Adrian, her quiet confidence and evident piety were the marks of an ideal wife. Adrian observed her from a distance, noting her composure and the respect she commanded among the congregation. She seemed untouched by the chaos of the world, grounded in her faith and her responsibilities. To him, she was a solution, someone who could step seamlessly into the role he needed her to play. In the quiet of the church, surrounded by the murmurs of prayer and the hum of faith, Adrian believed he had found the answer to his mother's prayers and his promise. But as he watched Naomi, he could not yet see the complexities that lay ahead, the truths that would challenge the simplicity of his decision. Adrian was not a man who hesitated when he saw what he wanted. And on that quiet Sunday morning, what he wanted was Naomi. She embodied everything he believed he needed: grace, humility, and devotion. But as he watched her standing with Ethan, the choir director, he realized she wasn't unattached. Still, Adrian was a man used to getting his way, and this would be no different. Adrian greeted Naomi with a disarming charm, his words deliberate and his intentions clear. He spoke of admiration, of noticing her during the service and being drawn to her quiet strength. To Ethan, his tone was courteous but clipped, acknowledging him only in passing. Adrian didn't need to say much, his wealth and status spoke volumes. He painted a picture of stability, of a life filled with security and opportunity. To Naomi, it was a vision that seemed almost too good to be true. And in the face of his polished confidence, Ethan's protest felt small, insignificant. Ethan spoke of love, of shared dreams, of promises made in quiet moments. But Adrian offered something Ethan could not: wealth, power, and the certainty of a life free from struggle. For Naomi, it was a choice that weighed heavily on her heart. Yet, as the moments stretched on, the allure of Adrian's offer began to overshadow Ethan's words. Adrian's parting words were simple but impactful. He told Naomi that she deserved more than just dreams, she deserved a reality filled with comfort and certainty. And with that, he left, confident that his words had planted a seed that could not be ignored. Naomi wrestled with her decision. She thought of Ethan, of his kindness and their shared history. But she also thought of Adrian, the life he offered, the promise of something greater. In her heart, she knew the path she was choosing, even as a part of her questioned it. And so, Naomi made her choice, a choice that would change the course of her life and bind her to Adrian in ways she could not yet foresee. It was a decision born of hope, but one that carried the weight of consequences she had yet to understand. The engagement between Adrian Kem and Naomi was met with widespread celebration. For Margaret, it was the answer to years of prayers and hope. For Naomi, it was the start of a life she had dreamed of, one filled with promise and stability. But as the days turned into weeks, small cracks began to appear in the picture-perfect union. Naomi began to notice things, subtle, almost imperceptible, that gave her pause. Adrian seemed distant, even in moments that should have brought them closer. He avoided physical affection, his touch hesitant and fleeting. Even the simplest gestures, like holding hands, seemed unnatural to him. Then there was Eric. Always present, always nearby. No matter where they went or what they did, Eric was there, an unspoken third member of their relationship. His presence felt both natural and intrusive, a dynamic Naomi couldn't quite place but chose to ignore. She noticed how comfortable Adrian was with Eric, how their bond seemed to carry a depth she couldn't quite reach. But rather than question it, Naomi convinced herself that their closeness was a testament to Adrian's loyalty and trustworthiness. After all, wasn't a good man supposed to have strong friendships? Even Adrian's reactions to intimacy were unusual. His discomfort was evident, his avoidance hard to miss. But Naomi, ever the optimist, interpreted his hesitation as respect, his restraint as a sign of his God-fearing nature. In her mind, she framed these red flags as virtues, convincing herself that she was blessed to have found a man so principled. Naomi clung to the narrative she had built in her mind, a narrative of love, respect, and faith. She believed Adrian's awkwardness was a reflection of his values, a sign that he was different from the men she had known before. And so, she chose to ignore the unease that crept into her heart, focusing instead on the future she had been promised. In a town where appearances often mattered more than truth, Naomi silenced her doubts and embraced the story she so desperately wanted to believe. Little did she know, the truth behind Adrian's distance was far more complex than she could have imagined. The wedding of Adrian and Naomi was the talk of the town. It was a celebration of love, wealth, and prestige, a union that symbolized not only the fulfillment of a mother's prayers but also the merging of tradition and modernity. For Naomi, it was a dream come true, a fairy tale wedding that made her feel like a queen. But amidst the laughter and celebration, Naomi began to notice things. Small moments that felt out of place. Adrian, ever composed, seemed more at ease with Eric than with her. During the reception, she caught glimpses of them sharing quiet jokes, their laughter private and unspoken. It was the kind of connection she had hoped to share with her new husband. Naomi tried to ignore these moments, convincing herself that they meant nothing. It was their wedding day, after all, a day meant for joy, not doubt. But as the evening wore on, the unease in her heart began to grow. On their wedding night, Naomi's expectations were simple. She hoped for closeness, for the intimacy that marked the start of a life together. But Adrian, citing exhaustion from the day's events, retreated to the couch, leaving Naomi alone in the bed meant for two. At first, Naomi told herself it was understandable. The wedding had been overwhelming, the day long and tiring. Surely, tomorrow would be different. But as the days of their honeymoon unfolded, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Adrian remained distant, his warmth reserved for public appearances. When the world wasn't watching, he retreated into himself, leaving Naomi to navigate her growing doubts alone. Naomi's mind raced with questions she couldn't voice. Was it nerves? Was it respect? Or was there something deeper, something she couldn't yet understand? She clung to the hope that things would change, that this distance was temporary. But with every passing day, her suspicions deepened. In the glow of her wedding day, Naomi had seen the future she longed for, a life of love and partnership. But as the reality of her new marriage began to take shape, she found herself standing at the edge of uncertainty, her trust battling with the quiet fears that had taken root in her heart. Naomi's doubts had grown too loud to ignore. The distance, the avoidance, the ever-present shadow of Eric, it all painted a picture she could no longer dismiss. And so, in a moment of desperation, she decided to seek the truth. What she found would shatter everything she thought she knew. Naomi had hoped she was wrong, that the answers she sought would prove her fears unfounded. But when she played back the footage later that night, the truth was undeniable. The images confirmed what she had long suspected but never dared to believe. Adrian and Eric were more than friends, more than business partners. Their bond was one of love, a love that had excluded her from the very beginning. Naomi could not remain silent. The betrayal she felt demanded answers, demanded confrontation. She found Adrian in his study, seated at his desk, his demeanor calm and composed. But as she stepped into the room, her presence carried a storm he could not ignore. Adrian admitted the truth, his words measured and deliberate. He spoke of societal pressure, of the expectations placed upon him as a man of his status. He told her of his mother's unyielding desire for him to marry, to fulfill a role he had never wanted. And in Eric, he had found solace, a love that defied the world's judgments but required secrecy to survive. Naomi's pain was raw, her questions relentless. Why me? She asked. Why drag me into a life you knew I could never truly be a part of? Adrian's response was simple, yet it cut deep. He had hoped that marriage would silence the world, that it would give his mother peace and allow him to maintain the image he had spent a lifetime building. In that moment, Naomi realized the depth of the deception she had been drawn into. The man she thought she knew was a stranger, his life a web of secrets and compromises. And as she walked away, her heart heavy with betrayal, she knew her own life would never be the same. Naomi's heart burned with questions that demanded answers. After confronting Adrian and hearing his truth, she realized there was another layer to the deception, one that led back to the very person who had orchestrated their union. Margaret. The woman who had prayed, pleaded, and pushed for this marriage. Naomi had to know how much she truly knew. Naomi's heart burned with questions that demanded answers. After confronting Adrian and hearing his truth, she realized there was another layer to the deception, one that led back to the very person who had orchestrated their union. Margaret. The woman who had prayed, pleaded, and pushed for this marriage. Naomi had to know how much she truly knew. Margaret admitted what Naomi had feared. Yes, she had known. She had known about Adrian's struggles, about the bond he shared with Eric. But to her, it was a burden that could be lifted, a problem that could be solved. Marriage, she believed, was the cure, an anchor that would pull Adrian back to the life she had envisioned for him. Margaret's words were direct, even dismissive. She told Naomi that love, real love, was about sacrifice. That Naomi's role as Adrian's wife was not just about companionship but about redemption, saving Adrian from a path that Margaret could not accept. But Margaret's response was swift and sharp. She accused Naomi of greed, of seeing only Adrian's wealth and ignoring the signs that had been there all along. "You wanted this life," Margaret said, her voice laced with frustration. "You saw the house, the money, the comfort. Don't pretend you didn't know something was off. You chose this just as much as I did." Margaret justified her actions with the weight of tradition and expectation. To her, this marriage was a necessity, a way to preserve the family's name and legacy. Adrian's truth, his struggles, they were secondary to the larger picture she had painted in her mind. For Margaret, the ends justified the means. But for Naomi, the realization was devastating. She had been a pawn in a game she never agreed to play, her life entangled in a web of lies spun by both Adrian and his mother. And as she walked away from Margaret's home, she knew there was no going back. In the midst of betrayal and heartbreak, Naomi discovered she was carrying Adrian's child. The realization brought both joy and anguish. She had always dreamed of becoming a mother, but not like this, not in the shadow of deception and a marriage built on lies. Naomi knew she had to make a choice, not just for herself but for the life growing inside her. Naomi told Adrian everything she felt, the pain of his betrayal, the burden of his secrets, and the impossibility of continuing their life together. She spoke not with anger but with clarity, her words carrying the weight of someone who had made peace with her decision. She was leaving. Adrian, shaken by the news of her pregnancy, begged her to stay. He spoke of his mother, of how her health had already begun to falter again, and how a grandchild would bring her joy in her final years. He offered Naomi a solution, a financial arrangement that would secure her and the child's future, even if their marriage lacked the love she deserved. He promised to provide everything for her and their child: luxury, stability, and freedom. But Naomi, though tempted by the offer, refused to let it define her. She agreed to stay temporarily, for the sake of Adrian's mother and the child, but she made one thing clear: she would not be trapped by his wealth or his lies. Her life, and the life of her child, would not be dictated by anyone but herself. For Naomi, Staying was no longer about salvaging a marriage, it was about reclaiming her independence while ensuring her child would be cared for. She saw through Adrian's promises, recognizing them for what they were, attempts to hold on to a life that had already crumbled. Naomi's strength lay not in anger or revenge but in her determination to rebuild. She chose to focus on herself and the future she could create for her child. It was a choice born of love, not for Adrian, but for the life she now carried and for the woman she knew she could become. Naomi's journey was far from over, but she had taken the first step toward freedom. In a world that had tried to define her by wealth and status, she found her strength in choosing herself. And as she walked away from the life she once thought she wanted, she carried with her the promise of a brighter future for her and for her child. Naomi's journey was one of heartbreak, revelation, and ultimately, transformation. In the wake of betrayal, she found herself faced with choices she never imagined. But from the ashes of a life she once thought she wanted, she began to rebuild, not with the wealth of others, but with the strength she discovered within herself. She poured her energy into creating a life of her own, learning to value herself not for what she could offer others, but for who she was. It was a lesson born of pain, but one that brought her closer to the woman she had always hoped to become. With her creativity and hard work, Naomi started a small business, turning her passion for fashion into a livelihood. She built connections in her community, creating a support system that reminded her she was never truly alone. Slowly, but surely, she began to thrive. Her greatest joy, however, came from her child, a life she had vowed to raise with love, resilience, and truth. Naomi was determined to give her baby the stability and happiness she had longed for herself. She promised to teach her child the value of integrity, strength, and self-worth. Naomi's story was not one of defeat but of rebirth. She had stepped away from a life of illusions and found something far greater, herself. She learned that true wealth was not in material gain but in the strength to stand alone, to heal, and to move forward with hope. And as she looked ahead, she knew that her journey had just begun. Naomi's story is one of courage and self-discovery. It is a journey that speaks to the strength it takes to walk away from what no longer serves you, even when the path ahead is uncertain. Her choices remind us all of the power of self-worth, the importance of truth, and the resilience found in the human spirit. We often ignore the signs when blinded by wealth or pressure. But let this be a reminder: your worth is not determined by someone else's riches or approval. Value yourself enough to walk away from what doesn't serve you. What are your thoughts on Naomi's journey? Share your perspective in the comments below. And if our story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories. Together, we can continue exploring the truths that shape us. See you in the next one.